Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire, looking to take the fatalities and property losses down, hopefully to zero in wildfires. I know that could take a lot of time and a lot of technology, but hey, we're not going anywhere, and it seems like a good problem to work on. I've got a really cool guest today. I've got Kendall. Oh my gosh, I'm going to mess this up. DeLyser?
DeLyser, but I like the
DeLyser,
French
okay.
pronunciation. That's good.
Okay, I was going for something French there. DeLyser, Kendall DeLyser, and Kendall is the director of climate science at American Forests. Did I get that part right, Kendall?
You did get that part right.
I
My last name is
pronounced
just
forests correctly.
you did.
Good.
DeLyser is the pronunciation of my last name.
DeLyser is what you go with now here.
Correct.
All right. So if anyone trying to reach out to Kendall and wants to get her name right, it's Kendall DeLyser. Although I suspect in France back in the day it was Delysée or something like that. But,
Yeah, my grandfather has a whole theory about that, but that's for another podcast.
Okay, well, let's get into that right away because I think we should know what your grandfather's theory is. What is it?
His theory is that it's actually a French-Dutch name, so DeLijser, and then coming in through Ellis Island, if you write I and J in cursive and lose the two dots, it becomes a Y. But it means of the songbird, and he always liked singing, so I think he liked that theory.
I love that theory. That's very cool. Of the songbird, huh? And at what point did he come in through Ellis Island?
He didn't. It was family before that. But, everyone has their desire to kind of trace their roots at some point. And that was a project of his a few years ago.
Fascinating. Well, a lot of people got here through Ellis Island.
It's true.
It was a really cool way to enrich our country with lots of new cultural diversity, values, ethics, the whole. Really, we wouldn't be who we were without all the people who came through Ellis Island. And I think it took a lot of bravery to leave everything you knew back in the old country and get on a boat and hope that the boat made it and then end up here because you wanted to start a new life. And so I think probably one of the reasons, I don't know, what do you think about this? That America is so full of entrepreneurial spirit is because so much of our DNA is people who had the gumption to get up, leave, and try something new.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm by no means an expert on entrepreneurship, so we're going far from what I know. But
creativity. So you're not an expert in entrepreneurship. That's fine. Not everyone needs to be, and it's probably better that way. But you are an expert in climate science. Was that a good segue? Does it work for you? Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Why don't we jump into climate science, because that's really your field, and apparently what's driving a lot of this wildfire stuff going on. Right, it's right. If it gets hotter and drier, things burn more.
Yeah, that's the general going theory, or at least part of it.
So, what type of work? Really, tell me more in detail about your work.
Yeah, so climate science can mean a lot of different things. For me, in my position at American Forests, it's really focusing on the interaction of forests and climate change and carbon, and thinking about the way that, because forests naturally capture carbon as they grow, they offer us a pretty good solution for getting carbon out of the atmosphere, reducing the impacts of climate change. So I study a lot of the interactions around that. Of course, wildfire is a big piece of that. Wildfires burn a lot in forests, and that can change the whole equation when you're talking about forest health, forest resilience, forest carbon.
So I have long contended that what you said, that we will never come up with a better carbon sink than a tree, right? You in many cases you don't even have to plant it. It runs off of solar power and water, and it turns CO2 in the air into wood. Yeah, right. Is that correct? It takes carbon out of the air and it turns it into wood.
Yeah. You want to go back to biology class, that miracle of photosynthesis. That's where this all comes from. So trees take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They keep the carbon and they turn it either into sugar, like sap, but it ends up in the wood, and about 50% of a tree is made out of carbon. So
I've been wanting to know what that number was actually for a long time.
Yeah.
So by weight, half a tree is half carbon.
Mm-hmm.
And once the tree is dried out and the remaining wood, what is that still 50%-ish?
50%. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So as long as the wood exists somewhere, if it's in a living tree, it's in a dead tree, it's in a branch on the ground, it's in the wood in your desk or in your house.
My dining room table, my chairs.
Your dining room table. Yeah, that's all got carbon in it.
So that's all carbon capture.
It is.
Right.
And pretty long term if you think of how long your dining table stays around.
Oh yeah, quite a while.
Yeah.
I never eat at it. I always seem to eat either, in bed or in the kitchen. But I am glad for that dining room table nonetheless.
Yeah. It's there for you. You ever need it.
So when we change the equation by letting forests burn up, or letting them burn up in ways that they didn't used to, we put all that carbon back out. And I'm guessing we don't like that now, but over the next 20-something years, I would imagine that carbon all becomes new trees.
It does. It's a bit more complicated than that.
I'm sure.
When a wildfire burns, even if a bunch of trees are killed, if the trees are still there, some of their carbon is still there because the wood is still there. But we do get pretty big emissions from especially these kind of larger, high severity fires that burn thousands of acres at a time. Those really kind of large scale catastrophic events are big emitters. And there's a lot of research coming out about that. It's a pretty growing area of focus because we have this short timeline over which to curb our emissions as much as we can. And there are things within our control, what we can do with, decarbonizing other sectors, with capturing carbon from trees and lands and soils. But then there are things like climate-driven disturbances that are kind of out of our control. And that's where wildfires come in a lot. There are a lot of things we can do to try to reduce the impacts of those fires, but they are, a reality. A lot of our forests evolved with wildfire to begin with. So we're never going to get rid of them entirely, and we should not be aiming to get rid of fire entirely, but we should be aiming to move it in a less severe, kind of more manageable, more regenerative direction.
Yeah, and so wildfires are certainly destructive in all cases, but in many cases, it's part of a natural cycle of destruction and regrowth.
Mm-hmm.
The part where we really get concerned is when it becomes destructive to humans and the built environment, which of course is encroaching more and more into wildlands, and so now more and more of the areas that naturally burned, we don't want to burn because of our own selfish reasons. So what's driving it? I guess that's a huge question. And then if you were able to get past that one, William, what should we be doing about it?
So you mean what's driving more wildfires?
What's driving more wildfire? Why are things? Why do things certainly appear to be getting worse?
Yeah. Well, it is a complex question, of course. And I think there's still a lot of room for science to help us figure out in more detail how all of these different drivers are interacting. But on the one hand, you have changes in climate not always getting hotter and drier. California gets a lot of atmospheric rivers and massive amounts of precipitation coming down, but you're getting these more extreme events, lots of precipitation, lots of drought, lots of heat. And those are extremes that forests haven't experienced in a long time. And, trees are pretty great. They're pretty resilient, but it takes them a while to adapt to things because they live for many, many years. You can't, on a dime, expect them to be able to change and adapt to these conditions. So in some sense, you have weather changes and climate changes that are happening faster than trees can adapt. And on the other hand, you have our legacy of the way that humans have interacted with this landscape. So indigenous communities for hundreds of years have used fire as a kind of management tool. We then moved into a period of our history where fire was thought to be entirely bad, and we needed to suppress every single wildfire that ever popped up. And that probably saved a lot of things in certain places. That may have been the right response, but it became a blanket management technique. And now we're trying to kind of come back from the legacy of having suppressed so many of those fires. If you look at pictures of forests in California from 1890 and 1950, there are a lot more trees on the landscape in the 1900s after we started excluding fires. And that's not how the landscape used to look. And so what we're seeing now is kind of a legacy of what we've done, what was well-intentioned at the time, trying to reduce the risk of wildfires and reduce the impacts on communities and forests. But now we're dealing with the kind of cycle that has set off in the forest. And you couple that with the drought events and the wind events and the insect events, and we end up with forests that are kind of struggling to keep up. So I think what we can do about it is try to send ourselves back in that direction. I don't think we need to go back to what historical conditions were, because we don't live in those historical conditions anymore. The climate is different, our needs are different, people live in different places. But if we can get back to what we think the ecosystem can actually handle, we have fewer trees on the landscape, we have healthier trees on the landscape, we have fires that go through at a lower intensity that actually help with some of that regeneration of trees. There are certain trees that have what are called serotinous cones that actually have to be burned in a fire for them to open and spread their seed. So there are trees that have evolved with all of this, and we need to keep it as part of the landscape, but we need to be doing that in a way that prevents these huge catastrophic events, burning millions of acres at a time, burning into housing areas and causing landslides later when that area hasn't recovered. There, again, it's just a whole cycle of impacts that we get from these large events.
And and I've seen those pictures you talked about, from the 1800s versus now, where the trees were separated into stands, and they knew not to be. I'm sorry, I don't mean to anthropomorphize trees, but they would be separated, and they wouldn't be on severe uphill slopes where they would get burned, and it looked like they were maybe half the number of trees that there are now. And we built up this huge fuel debt by putting out what should have burned. So now we're paying the price for that, and not just us, right? The whole planet. Now, the 1910 policy, put out every fire before 10 a.m. and if it's 10:05, you get a 24-hour extension, which was nice. So that was really a U.S. thing, and that would explain some of our fuel debt and excess fire. But we're really seeing it all over the world. Canada didn't have U.S. Forestry Service doing that, and they're certainly generating their fair of smoke these days. I don't know what the policies in Brazil were. Greece is burning down. South of France is burning down. Like, we're seeing it everywhere. So certainly I would concede, yes, our policies did not do anything to help here. But whatever is going on seems to be going on around the globe. So what are some of those other factors besides our U.S. interference?
Yeah.
Like, why is the rest of the world also burning?
It's a great question, and it's a very location-specific one. The answer in Canada is not the same as the answer in Brazil. But I think a lot of it comes back to seeing these changes in climate and changes in weather that drive other kind of disturbances. So for Canada, similar to a lot of the Western US, there have been these massive bark beetle outbreaks, sometimes enabled by a drought in a few years before that, which kind of get the tree's immune system a little bit down anyway, and then they have a really hard time fighting off these beetles. When it's warmer through the winter, the beetles also can reproduce more. They don't freeze and die. So we just get these kind of massive populations of what are natural pests sometimes, but they're just kind of getting more out of proportion than they used to be. And then when you have a bunch of dead trees on the landscape, sometimes you have fires started by human error or human influence, and sometimes it's just a lightning strike, something out of our control. But if you have a lot of dead trees in an area, then you're going to have some pretty massive fires. And I think that was a lot of the situation for Canada. I think I'm not as much of an expert on the tropical side of things, but I think we're seeing a lot of changes, just seeing a lot of changes in the environment and seeing a lot of changes in those conditions that are probably enabling a lot of these fires to pop up all over the place. Each place is going to have its own unique forest health concerns, forest health issues that are being driven by either local management decisions and or the combination with a changing climate. So I suspect that if you looked closely at what was happening in each of these places, you'd find a mix of those things influencing fires all over the place.
Well, that brings me to the next question. Like, what are we doing to reduce the amount of lightning?
Well,
and right. I mean, obviously, that would reduce the number of lightning-induced fires.
It would. I think we might have to call Zeus for that one. I don't know how else we handle lightning, but
okay. Well,
I think what we can do is try to change conditions on the ground so that when lightning comes, we can't presume to control what nature does, but when lightning comes, if there's not a huge amount of dead trees just sitting there really close together, ready to all ignite together, we have a better chance of that fire being smaller. We have a better chance of fire crews being able to get in and start to contain it. So I think we need to just do what we can to be prepared for those situations, not thinking that we can stop them entirely, but enabling ourselves, making it a little bit easier for us to respond.
I think they had it right when they made Zeus and Poseidon and Aeolus, the main gods, because weather really is the big thing, right? It's we think about all of the other impacts, on our lives and whatnot, but whether it's a hurricane, fire weather. Okay, we used to call it rain. Now it's an atmospheric river, right? Oh, and it's not even rain right now. It's a rain event, right? What's going on outside? It's raining. No. We're having a rain event. When did everything become an event instead of just being what it was? And how does that help?
Well, that's an interesting philosophical question, but I think we probably, my uneducated guess would be that we started using the word event when things got abnormal. And it's no longer just raining. It's a rain event if it's like a lot of rain or it's happening really fast or it's raining really hard. It's not what we expect from just like a nice little rain anymore.
I see. Sprinkles. We're having a sprinkle event.
Yeah. A lot of sprinkles.
A lot of sprinkles. So you look at this, I mean, your organization is called American Forests. Mm-hmm. Is your focus really American forests, or are you being cognizant and informed by what's going on in forests elsewhere?
We're always tracking what's happening across the globe, but all of our work really focuses on forests in the U.S.
Okay.
That's where, we were founded in 1875, and we've really focused on working in this country for a long time. But that doesn't mean we don't have partnerships with other places. A lot of the work that I do, I have partners in the Canadian Forest Service. We talk to folks in other countries and other sectors. You can't really think about forests in the U.S. You can't think about climate change in the U.S. as an isolated issue. You made the point earlier that the entire globe is paying for some of the emissions that are coming from these different fires, and it's really a global problem. I think what we're focused on is figuring out what we can do in the U.S. to do our part to make sure that forests stay healthy and resilient, that they give us all the benefits to local communities that we want them to have. And there are plenty of those issues to work on within the U.S. alone, but always thinking about that with an eye towards how much can we do here to do our best to fight climate change, to make it a little bit easier to meet those global goals that we have.
So we talk about fighting climate change. we assume like, okay, we're here and climate change is here, and we're fighting each other.
Mm.
Is there some way we can get on the same page and be, uh, healthier climate advocates
Mm.
rather than fighting something? Could we be
Yeah.
doing more of something or less of something, where instead of being at war with the climate, we are at peace with the climate and helping it to be healthier, at least healthier
Mm.
for us, right? Because
Yeah.
there are species of life that can exist under virtually any conditions. Uh, that does not include us, right? We're only comfortable in a very narrow temperature and humidity range and
Mm.
oxygen concentration. So what we're really trying to do is just make the climate more palatable to humans.
Mm.
That is our bias. It's entirely possible that a warmer, wetter climate would actually favor the growth of trees and other vegetation. Right? That's why we make greenhouses, to make it hotter and wetter, and the
For
plants
certain
like that,
trees,
hmm? Hmm?
certain plants
Yeah,
like that, not all
right.
plants.
So no, no. So what should we be doing? What's your top 10 list,
Mm.
or at least three of them
Yeah.
that individuals could do, in their daily lives, that would contribute towards us having a healthier climate for us?
Mm. Well, now you're asking a slightly different question than when you started, because
I know.
we,
I
yeah,
switch around because when you say
yeah.
things, then I realize, maybe,
Mm.
and this is really true right across the board, right? Is you can't solve a problem unless you're thinking about it the right way.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
hopefully, the more you learn about something, the more your thinking becomes to align
Hmm.
with something more constructive than what you originally believed.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
experienced that through many divorces and etc. Right?
There are different answers depending on the scale that you're talking about. So
Okay.
I could take that kind of systemic angle first. I think there are a lot of things that individuals can do, but we need systems to change. We need policies to change. We need entire sectors to change what they're doing in order to stop fighting climate. I feel like in a way we're fighting climate because we're continuing to emit a lot of carbon and greenhouse gases. We are actively making things worse with those activities. And so the way for us to get more aligned with climate and stop making things worse for ourselves is to stop those impacts that we are directly having on the atmosphere that are accelerating climate change. And there's all kinds of research that's coming out about this all the time. IPCC keeps releasing these reports that said, hey, clock is ticking, we got to do a lot. But I think what we can take from that is that there is no silver bullet. There's no one thing that is going to solve all the problems. We cannot solve all of our climate issues on the back of trees alone, but we cannot get where we need to go without having a healthy carbon sink, which is that service that forests give us. They're capturing a bunch of carbon every year. So we need to be thinking about this on all fronts. It requires a lot of coordination. It requires a lot of work across sectors. So in my capacity, American Forest, I can really talk about the forest side of things. But I think we also need to be encouraging other sectors to be thinking about things along the same lines, thinking about how they can reduce their footprints, thinking about how we can clean up our electricity grid and start to run more things off of electricity once it's clean. This is, not my area of expertise, but
No,
I
but
think we
it's
could take some
necessary.
parallels. What we need to do in the forest sector is make sure that forests stay healthy and resilient, that they're doing their best job. If you have healthy trees, if they're growing well, back to photosynthesis, if they're growing, then they're capturing carbon. And as long as we can enable that to happen, then we're doing a good thing. We're doing our part in the forestry sector. And we need all of our sectors to be thinking about that in the same way. What is the thing that we need to do, and how do we put it all together?
I do have a science question about that, because I've seen conflicting information. You said as long as they're growing, they're capturing carbon,
Mm-hmm.
versus as long as they're living, they're capturing carbon. So I had initially heard this theory, once trees reach maturity, they stop being such a carbon sink and they
Mm-hmm.
become more neutral. Well, and that makes sense because they're turning less carbon into wood. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
then I saw a more recent study that measured, the old growth forests and found that, yes, they're also absorbing carbon. They're carbon negative. Um, and
Yeah.
that was a surprise to me. I saw that in the documentary. What's it called? Elemental.
Mm.
Um, Reimagining Wildfire. And they showed a study where they built big towers and put them over big forests, and they measured the CO2 coming in and out. And so, what is the latest science on that? Are the old growth trees? And I wouldn't want to say anything to jeopardize them because they've been around for a long time and we love them.
Mhm.
But as a carbon sink, how do they compare to a freshly burned area where it's all saplings and we
Mm.
see lots of carbon absorption happening?
Yeah. So I think the answer is that you need a balance of all these things across the landscape. Those
Okay.
big old trees have been growing for a long time, and because they have a lot of wood in them, they store a lot of carbon. And trees do continue to grow every single year, albeit sometimes very slowly. So I think part of what we need to re-inject into the conversation is this kind of nuance that you can't take a principle that exists for one tree and assume it exists for all of them. Each tree,
Okay.
each species, each region is going to grow very differently. There are some trees that have a capacity to continue growing very quickly and putting on a lot of wood for hundreds of years. There are other trees that just don't quite live that long. But the point of all of this is to think about, if you think of making an analogy between trees and humans, humans have different growth spurts. When they're really young, they start growing, they kind of take off in their teenage years and they grow really quickly. And then, we all continue growing, we all
And then thank
continue
goodness they get past
consuming
those teenage
material.
years. Right.
Yep. Yep. If we had teenagers all over the place, we'd have,
Oh my goodness.
a very, very interesting world.
Dramatic.
Yeah. So just because growth has slowed down doesn't mean that growth isn't happening. But it's also important to think about talking about an individual tree versus an entire forest. So
Yes.
individual trees can continue to grow, but if you have a forest, that means you have multiple trees around, you have branches, you have stumps, you have leaves on the ground, all these different kinds of things that decay. And so you can have a different balance between what's happening with one individual tree and what's happening across a forest or across an entire stand, where you have more of those different kind of places that carbon can be moving around.
We talk about stands of trees. What's the actual definition of a stand?
Well, that depends on if you're talking to a forest manager or someone else.
Or metric or American standard, right?
That doesn't actually
I'm
make that
kidding.
much of a difference.
A metric stand.
So
It's 2.2 US stands, right?
it is maybe the one measurement where we all kind of think about things in a
Yeah.
similar way.
So how do you think about it? Or what's a
Well,
useful way to think about it?
so I think a useful way to think about it from a silvicultural perspective, which is the science of managing trees, a stand is kind of one chunk of forest that you want to kind of treat the same or
Okay.
that has similar characteristics. It might have a largely the same age or largely the same species composition. And if you're thinking about managing on the landscape, you could think about a stand as a unit in which you're going to kind of have the same management activity. In a more
Okay.
colloquial sense, you think about stands as like, oh, there's a nice stand of trees out back,
Right.
which is not an inaccurate way to think about it. But in a lot of the work that we're doing, anytime you're connecting it to management, it's basically functionally a management unit. And the size and the shape and the orientation will depend a lot on the landscape that you're in. But it is basically thinking about that kind of unit across the landscape, like a puzzle piece that you can decide to do something with.
I see. Okay. That's practical and useful. So if you were, the forest czar, and you had infinite power over, how we manage our forests, our electrical grid, our carbon emissions, what are the things, what are the levers that you would pull to make the biggest difference fastest? Because, we are told like there's a time limit on this problem.
Yeah.
and show your work?
Yeah. The bar is high and we have to work. We do have to show our work. We have to make sure that we're doing things correctly. So again, I can't really speak for anything outside of the forest sector as an expert. I have
Okay.
my own opinions, but I think the levers that I would pull is to make sure that each industry or each sector is really committed towards working to reduce emissions or capture more carbon. On the forest side of things, that really, again, fundamentally comes down to having these kind of healthy and resilient forest landscapes. And of course, for a podcast called The Fire Break, we've talked a lot about wildfires. That's a big issue. It's a big threat posed to forest health and resilience in the Western US. There are a lot of different issues that face forests in the Eastern US, in Canada and Mexico and Brazil. But I think being able to understand what the biggest threats are to forest resilience and then coming up with a plan to deal with them is really the way that we need to go about it. And it can't be done in a blanket way. We need that kind of regional nuance. You can talk about wildfires in New York, but that's not quite such an issue. That's not the way you're going to get a lot of people to really dig in and think about how forests need to be managed in that state. So I think being able to understand what those biggest kind of drivers of change are and figure out how to respond to them. A lot of the research that I've been leading for American Forest is looking at a series of state-by-state carbon modeling projects where we're asking this kind of question. We're asking the question of, there are a lot of things that forest managers can do on the landscape. Typically, when you talk about natural climate solutions, all the things people say we can do with forests to capture more carbon, so far, a lot of those analyses have been kind of limited. The science hasn't gotten into the whole toolbox of things that forest managers actually have available to them. And in some sense, that's because we don't have the science to support the modeling yet, but we're trying to push that boundary a little bit and solve that problem with some of our modeling work. So thinking about all of the things that we can do across the landscape. For example, for a project we did with Maryland and Pennsylvania, we talked with a lot of partners in the state who told us that deer really like to eat little seedlings and saplings. And it's actually a big problem because you have a big deer population. If they eat all the little trees, then you have no little trees growing up to replace the old trees. You can imagine that in a human population context being quite a problem. If you have no kids, then, eventually your population is going to be in trouble.
Right.
And so we actually did some work thinking about this is a big driver of the problems that we're seeing across the landscape. If we can get more of those young trees to grow, if we can get more of that regeneration happening, either through natural processes or through actually tree planting, we can start to revitalize the carbon sink in those states. And that's obviously a very different issue than thinking about wildfires in the Western US, but it's equally important. And being able to think about what those big drivers are and then start to think about how to change them, it's really the best way to ensure that our forests stay healthy and resilient in the future and give us all those benefits that we need.
And so there's this endless chain of unintended consequences, right? That we eliminate the wolves and therefore we remove one of the deer's predators, and then the deer overgrow, and then they eat all the saplings and we have less trees. And right. So it seems like in most cases where we intervene, we screw stuff up. Right.
We do
sooner
have a
or later,
right?
We're not the best species in terms of our impact on nature, right?
I think New Zealand is one of the best examples of that. So I used to live in New Zealand.
Of the good or
for
the
the
bad
Department
part?
of Conservation. Well, both.
Some of each, okay.
When it was first being colonized and settled, the British decided, hey, we like hunting rabbits. We're going to bring some rabbits over. But there are no native predators for rabbits, so rabbits did what rabbits normally do. Then they decided, hey, we're going to bring over some stoats because stoats like to eat rabbits in the UK. Well, what they don't have in the UK is a lot of birds that nest on the ground because birds evolved without ground predators in New Zealand. So the stoats were like, rabbits run away. These tasty eggs are just sitting here. So then the stoats go and eat all the native bird eggs and bird populations start to plummet. And you got this entire loop of Humans started one problem, tried to fix it, and created another problem. And now, to their credit, the Department of Conservation has realized that this was not good. They've spent many, many years trying to right the ship and trying to correct that cycle. So it's coming around back to the good side, but it takes a lot of commitment and it takes a lot of awareness and education to help people understand what that history was, why it's problematic, and what the best ways are to be able to fix it.
So do you have a similar, slogan like the doctors do? Start with "do no harm."
No, I think it's a little more complicated because we've already started messing with the forest landscape.
Okay.
And in some places, if you're already driving too fast, just taking your hands off the wheel is not necessarily going to help the problem. You have to figure out how to actually take your foot off the gas or change direction. So I think we should certainly be operating with the principle of do no harm, but there are a lot of things to manage in forests that you can't necessarily complete or kind of satisfy everyone's goals at the same time. I think what we should be thinking about is how to make sure that we're not making things worse, learning from our past mistakes and thinking critically about, okay, if we start changing this management option, what are the unintended consequences going to be? What are the other things that we might not foresee that in 50 years we're going to be paying for this?
Yeah,
and
right.
Just thinking with a little bit more foresight, I think would be pretty prudent. But we can't let that get in the way of doing something because, we don't have a lot of time. I think we know certain things that send us in the right direction. We may not know exactly how far in the right direction they're going to send us, but if we know things that are going to be helpful, that are kind of no regret scenarios, then we should be pursuing those while we figure out the nuance behind these more complicated options.
Well, yeah. We don't really need to do anything, right? As long as we can get other countries to change what they're doing.
No, let's
Right?
let's not even
Right.
entertain that. We have
Right. As long
so
as we
much
can get Brazil
responsibility.
to start cutting down the forests and China to stop reducing emissions, then we're good. Right? We seem to spend a lot of time pointing fingers at what other countries are doing wrong instead of taking responsibility for correcting our own behaviors.
Yeah, I think it's important to do both. It's important for the international community to hold each other accountable for things, but it's also important to make sure that we're doing everything that we can. It gives us a better position from which to say, look, we've taken these steps. We're actually putting in the work. Why don't you join us?
Well, when I asked you what we should be doing, you said that each sector should be enhancing its commitment to reducing emissions. But commitment doesn't get carbon out of the air. Like specific actions do. And commitment doesn't reduce emissions, right? It's just your attitude. And while, in your own personal health, your attitude might impact your health, it's because your attitude impacts your behaviors and your behaviors impact your health. So what are the behaviors that we would like to accompany those commitments?
Yeah, that's a great question and very well said that it starts with an attitude shift, but it can't end there.
Right.
All the time we see people saying like, hey, this is a great idea, but if there's no follow through, then we're not going to get very far.
Right.
So
and
I think
politicians, I'm committed to this, I'm committed to that. Okay, so what are you actually doing? I'm working on my re-election campaign. Thanks. That's really helping. How many million brochures did you print out?
Yeah, I think
Right.
at the risk of sounding a bit like a broken record, the actions that we need to follow those commitments are really just figuring out what those no regret strategies might be and pursuing them, but also not stopping there, right? We can't say, okay, I'm just going to take the low hanging fruit and that's good enough. I think for forests, we need to be, in some sense, changing the way we think about forests. Stop talking about young forests and old forests separately. They're all part of this continuous landscape. If we think about managing the landscape in a holistic way, we need representation of old trees. We need representation of young trees. We need representation of middle-aged trees. We need all of that across the landscape for the ecosystem to really do what it needs to do. And so focusing on certain issues is very important, making sure that our forests recover after wildfire, for example. I have colleagues that have been doing some great work on that front, but also then being able to push that conversation into, okay, well, if we're going to replant some trees in this fire scar, let's think about the species that we want to put there. Let's think about the distribution of those trees on the landscape. Do we want to plant them all in lines? Do we want to plant them in gaps? How do we set this forest up for success in the future, knowing what we know about how climate might be changing, how certain species might be better at growing under hotter, drier conditions, or better at growing under wetter, colder ones, depending on where you are. So really thinking about that, not just in the short term, put a tree in the ground and that's it. Really thinking about the kind of long-term maintenance, the monitoring, setting that forest up for success. That's going to be really critical to making sure that we don't end up with the same problems in 50 years that we're facing now.
And there seems to be in some areas a type of immobilizing fear about doing the wrong thing, leading us to do nothing.
Yep.
I'm here in your birth city of Boulder, where I could go for a drive and I could see all of the burn scars or fire scars, as you call them, from the past 20 years. And what you see is, standing dead, piles of carbon, where they haven't gone in to cut them down to allow more sun to hit the ground. They haven't really done anything, it looks like. What they've done is they've turned really expensive real estate into real estate nobody wants to buy, or to look at. And I don't really see any move towards reforestation. Is that because we don't have a forester here, or the county doesn't have someone or some group in charge of how do we reforest the area? Because or do we just figure, in 100 years when we come back here, there'll be more trees here and it'll be whatever nature decides to put.
In certain places, you can just wait for the forest to recover on its own. But a lot of what we're seeing is that in some of those really high intensity fire areas that are bigger footprints, so you have many acres altogether, the kind of interior of those areas might actually be too far away from a living tree with a seed to ever be able to reseed itself.
I see.
So we've been focusing a lot on those areas, thinking about prioritizing reforestation in those places that from the science don't seem likely to come back on their own. But there's also this issue, just because this has happened across the landscape, we still need the workforce capacity, we need the agency capacity to actually be able to do something with those acres. And a lot of what we've seen from our partnerships, the various folks that we work with, is that even if there's intention wanting to go out and reforest some of these areas, if agencies are understaffed, if they get held up by not having people to process contracts quickly enough, if we don't have a nursery pipeline that actually has those trees available to go into the ground when we need them, there's all of the supporting infrastructure that when you talk about forests and fires, very easy to forget, but it's critical to actually doing anything on the ground. You need people to be able to process the contracts. You need the funding for the contracts. You need the people with the expertise and the time to go out into the field. You need the seeds in the nursery. Seeds have to be collected and grown for 2 to 3 years in a nursery before they're ready for life in the wild. There's a time delay in all of this. And so thinking about behavior change is also thinking about what are those kind of elements of the supporting infrastructure or elements of that infrastructure system that are also pinch points, and starting to work on those.
So the big takeaway about what we should be doing is there's a lot to think about.
That's always the case.
Right.
But I think in part the answer is that we need to do a lot of things simultaneously. We can't put all our eggs in one basket, and we can't let uncertainty paralyze our decision making. There are certain practices we know will send us in the right direction, trying to recover those post-burn areas, for example, as long as we do it right. If we do it with the right tree species and the right setup, and we're making sure to monitor and make sure that that forest actually stays healthy and resilient.
Well, I
That's
could
just one of
understand.
many options.
Yes, yes, and I could understand why we're hesitant to do something since most of what we've done has been wrong. That we should now second guess ourselves is probably appropriate. Uh,
Yes. I I think acting with more basis of science and acting with a bit more foresight is certainly a good idea, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this case because we have a limited time window in which to get anything right.
I say, well, let's get on with it,
Let's go.
right? Yay, science!
Science
Absolutely,
will hopefully help us figure out what we need to be doing and where.
it will. Well, I hope that we see uh, more and more kids going into science, and some of those kids going into forestry, and
That's the hope.
hopefully there's still a problem left to work on when they come to market.
Ooh, I mean, if there's not a problem for them to work on, we've
They'll,
succeeded.
they'll be some right, yeah, or we failed so miserably that there's nothing left to do about it.
I'll take the
I
we've
hope it's not
succeeded
that.
angle on that one.
I'm gonna go with the humans are ingenious, and we tend to get ourselves into jams of our own making, but then we figure out how to get out. I remember in 1980 something, when they said, well, you know, left unchecked, the AIDS crisis is going to kill 80% of the population in the next 5 years. And, human ingenuity comes in and we invent new stuff and we come up with better ways of dealing with things. And we can change the time metrics with innovation. So please, innovators out there, get in touch with Kendall because the industry needs it. Kendall, thank you so much for joining me on the Fire Break today. I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. This has been a great conversation. Look forward to more.
Thank you. And please reach out. Any new developments, new technologies, new specific advice for people or for industries. We want to help to get the word out. And maybe, I got into this because I love walking out in the forest with my kids, and I had this fear that if we didn't do something one day, there wouldn't be a forest for them to go walk in with their kids. So I'm gunning for you, not in a good way. I'm rooting for you. Oh, well, I guess that's a tree term, isn't it? Okay.
All
right. Well,
we appreciate it, but
I am rooting
I think
for
you can also breathe a little bit easier knowing that there are a lot of smart people working on this issue. There are times that I've seen just truly great minds all trying to work towards some kind of solution. And as you said, humans tend to be creative. We can get ourselves out of a jam. So
that's encouraging. I
don't want to be all doom and gloom. I think we can get ourselves going in the right direction.
No, you come off neither doomy nor gloomy. So
well, that's good.
thanks for the work that you're doing and that American Forest is doing. Appreciate it much. All right, folks. Well, you've been enjoying some time with Kendall DeLyser, which, if nothing else in the last hour, I figured out how to pronounce her name properly. So, see, there is progress, even sometimes in the short term. And so, thanks for joining us on the Fire Break. This Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, trying to make fires less deadly and less costly. And we'll see you on the next one. Take care.